October 27th, 1962, a Saturday. Havana sweats under a Caribbean sun, 90 miles from the Florida coastline. In the living rooms of ordinary Americans, televisions flicker with news that nobody can fully process. On the Brooklyn Bridge, cars idle in afternoon traffic. In Moscow, secretaries stand in bread lines outside gray concrete shops. Somewhere in the dark water of the North Atlantic, deep beneath the surface, a Soviet submarine is running out of oxygen, and the man inside is holding the fate of the planet in his hands. We think the Cuban Missile Crisis was about communism against democracy. We think it was about Khrushchev's aggression and Kennedy's nerve. We believe it was a geopolitical chess match played by two ideologies on opposite sides of history. It wasn't. Ignore the newsreel footage. Look at the ledger. What you find isn't a story about ideology at all. It is a story about insolvency. It is the story of a nation that couldn't afford to lose, couldn't afford to back down, and couldn't afford to keep fighting. The missiles were never pointed at cities because of politics. They were pointed there because of debt. Every crisis has a balance sheet, and this one had been bleeding for decades before anyone noticed. Not as the crumbling empire we know in hindsight. Not as the bankrupt state history would later expose. You have to see it at its terrifying height, when the rest of the world genuinely believed it was unstoppable. In October of 1957, the USSR launched Sputnik into orbit, a small metal sphere beeping its signal from the darkness of space. And with that beep, the entire Western world felt something cold move through it. Fear, pure, uncut fear. A nation that had lost 27 million people in World War II. A nation whose farmland had been turned to ash and whose cities had been reduced to rubble by Nazi invasion. That nation had beaten America to space. The Soviet machine had rebuilt itself from nothing in just 12 years. It had detonated its first nuclear bomb in 1949, years ahead of American intelligence projections. It had tested a hydrogen bomb in 1953. By 1962, it commanded an arsenal that could turn any city in the Western Hemisphere into a graveyard. The parades down Red Square were breathtaking in their scale. Intercontinental ballistic missiles rolling past the Kremlin on flatbed trucks, enormous steel cylinders that could reach New York in 30 minutes. Soldiers in perfect formation, the crowd waving red flags beneath a cold, gray Moscow sky. To the Western world watching through newspaper photographs, the Soviet Union looked like a permanent force of nature, vast, disciplined, invincible, an empire that had risen from catastrophe and would stand for centuries. Here is the truth that Cold War strategists on both sides quietly understood, but almost never said out loud. The Soviet Union was running an arms race against the single richest nation in human history, and it was doing so with an economic engine that was tearing itself apart. The United States in 1960 had a GDP of approximately $543 billion. The Soviet Union's GDP, by the most generous Western estimates, sat at roughly $100 billion. America had more than 5 times the economic output of its rival. 5 times. And yet Moscow was spending a larger percentage of its entire economy on defense than Washington was. Soviet military expenditure through the 1960s is estimated to have consumed between 15 and 17% of total GDP. The Americans were spending roughly 9%. Every ruble spent on a missile was a ruble not spent on bread, on hospitals, on housing, on the roads that connected a country spanning 11 time zones. Every nuclear warhead came at the direct cost of consumer goods that never appeared on Soviet shelves. The arms race was not a military competition. It was a trap, and the USSR walked into it willingly because it had no alternative. Backing down meant losing face. Losing face meant losing legitimacy. Losing legitimacy meant losing power. Losing power meant losing everything. The addiction had no exit. A machine so vast and so wealthy that it could outspend, outbuild, and simply outlast any challenger on Earth. The factories in Detroit, the banks on Wall Street, the oil fields of Texas and Oklahoma. These were the artillery that truly mattered in the Cold War. While Soviet engineers were genuinely brilliant, they were operating on fumes. The military machine they were competing against was not a government project. It was the total economic output of a continental civilization, mobilized and pointed like a weapon directly at Moscow's survival. By the late 1950s, the cracks in the Soviet system were becoming impossible to hide if you knew where to look. Soviet agriculture was collapsing quietly and completely. Khrushchev's Virgin Lands campaign, launched in 1953, had promised to transform the vast steppe of Kazakhstan into a breadbasket that would feed the socialist world. The USSR, an empire that spanned 1/6 of the Earth's landmass, grain from the West, grain, the most basic fuel of human civilization. An empire with nuclear weapons pointed at every major city on Earth could not feed its own people without paying its enemies for the privilege. Following Sputnik, military research, and advanced technology, the American response to Soviet nuclear ambition was not purely diplomatic, it was financial. Washington opened every spending tap it had, and Moscow, watching its rival write check after unlimited check from an economy that showed no signs of strain, felt it had no choice but to match every dollar with a ruble it did not have and could not afford. By 1961, Khrushchev faced a domestic crisis that had nothing to do with missiles and everything to do with money. The Soviet economy was stagnating after its post-war recovery burst. Industrial growth was slowing. The communist paradise of abundance that had been promised to an entire generation was failing to materialize. Citizens who had sacrificed for decades were being asked to sacrifice further. The legitimacy of the Soviet state rested on a single promise that the system would eventually deliver. If it could not deliver bread, it needed to deliver fear. Fear of the West. Fear of capitalist encirclement. Fear that required an ever-expanding military response. The missiles were not just weapons. They were political theater in a slow-motion bankruptcy proceeding. In June of 1961, Khrushchev met Kennedy in Vienna and tried to use bluster where he lacked real leverage. He demanded that Western powers abandon Berlin. He threatened. He postured. He banged metaphorical tables. But behind all that noise was a man whose country's balance sheet was hemorrhaging from every artery. The Berlin Wall, constructed in August of 1961, is remembered as an act of Soviet aggression. Look at it differently. East Germans were fleeing to the West at approximately 1,000 people per day. Every engineer, every doctor, every skilled worker who crossed that border was irreplaceable capital draining permanently from the Soviet bloc's economic body. The wall was not built from strength. The wall was a tourniquet. In the spring of 1962, Khrushchev made the decision that would bring the entire planet to within minutes of annihilation. He would secretly place Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, 90 miles from the American coastline. The historical debate about why has never fully settled. Some argue it was to shield Cuba from a repeat of the Bay of Pigs invasion. Some argue it was to counter the American Jupiter missiles already deployed in Turkey, sitting 90 miles from Soviet territory. Both explanations are credible, but they miss the ledger. The American Jupiter missiles in Turkey had cost the United States approximately $700 million in total deployment, infrastructure, and operational expenses. The equivalent Soviet deployment to Cuba was a fraction of that figure because the hardware already existed. The R-12 and R-14 missiles were already manufactured. The nuclear warheads were already assembled. The delivery systems were waiting in warehouses. What Khrushchev was doing, in the coldest possible accounting terms, was achieving strategic nuclear parity with the United States at a fraction of the cost of building the additional intercontinental missiles required to accomplish the same deterrent effect from Soviet soil. Cuba was not a military gamble. Cuba was a budget optimization. The smoking gun sits in National Security Council memoranda from October of 1962, declassified decades later. American analysts circulated assessments noting something that the public headlines never mentioned. Soviet military expansion was systematically outpacing Soviet economic capacity. The specific word that appeared in the classified analysis was unsustainable. They were watching an empire spend money it did not have on weapons it could not stop building to maintain a global status it could no longer afford to hold. The foreclosure was already in motion. The only question was its timing. In Kremlin meeting transcripts preserved in Soviet-era archives and made available after 1991, Khrushchev spoke with unusual directness to his generals. The Cuban operation was partly explicitly about economics. He spoke of equalizing the balance, not the nuclear balance, not the military balance, the financial balance. He wanted to achieve the same deterrent leverage the Americans enjoyed, without the catastrophic cost of manufacturing the thousands of additional ICBMs that achieving genuine parity through conventional buildup would require. Cuba was a shortcut born of insolvency. The foreclosure was already signed. Cuba was simply the last asset being leveraged before the liquidation sale began. The most dangerous moment arrived on October 27, 1962, what historians would later call Black Saturday. An American U-2 reconnaissance plane was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. A second U-2 accidentally penetrated Soviet airspace over Alaska and nearly triggered an interception response. An American destroyer, the USS Beale, began dropping depth charges on Soviet submarine B-59, attempting to force it to surface. The submarine was carrying a nuclear torpedo with a warhead roughly equivalent to the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The submarine's captain, Valentin Savitsky, believed that war had already begun above him. He ordered the torpedo prepared for immediate launch. He was one authorization away from firing. That authorization required agreement from all three senior officers aboard. The flotilla commander, Vasily Arkhipov, refused to sign. One man, one refusal. On a vessel running out of breathable air, in heat exceeding 100 degrees, surrounded by men who were convinced the world above was already burning, the entire nuclear fate of human civilization rested on Vasily Arkhipov's refusal to authorize a single launch order. On October 28, 1962, Khrushchev broadcast a radio message agreeing to withdraw Soviet nuclear missiles from Cuba. Kennedy pledged not to invade Cuba and agreed, in a private channel that would not be made public for decades, to remove the American Jupiter missiles from Turkey within 6 months. The headlines announced a diplomatic triumph. Kennedy looked resolute. Khrushchev looked reasonable. The television cameras showed relieved faces on both continents. The world inhaled for the first time in 13 days. But read the fine print. Sovereignty is solvency. And on that October morning, the Soviet Union had just cashed in the final reserve of its nuclear credibility. Khrushchev's colleagues in the Presidium viewed the Cuban withdrawal as something far less noble than diplomacy. They saw humiliation. The most powerful military state in the communist world had pointed its missiles at Florida, been confronted, and blinked. The image was devastating and irreversible. In October of 1964, exactly 2 years after Black Saturday, Khrushchev's colleagues removed him from power. The man who had nearly ended the world was dismissed not by an enemy. He was dismissed by his own party, which could no longer bear the financial and political cost of his performance. The Soviet economy did not recover. The defense burden did not ease. Military spending remained locked at catastrophic percentages throughout the 1960s and 1970s. The Strategic Arms Limitation Treaties, SALT I signed in 1972, and SALT II negotiated through 1979, are remembered as diplomatic milestones of the Cold War. Strip away the ceremony. What they actually were was debt restructuring negotiations. Two nations that had been spending themselves toward insolvency, sitting across a table and working out a payment schedule. Nothing more elegant than that. By 1980, the Soviet military-industrial complex was consuming an estimated 25% of the entire national economy. Consumer shelves were bare. The queue for a basic apartment in Moscow had stretched 2 decades. The ruble kept printing. The numbers kept looking like growth. But the bread wasn't there. The shoes weren't there. The hope wasn't there. Afghanistan began in December of 1979. 9 years of grinding, unwinnable conflict that would cost the Soviet Union approximately $50 billion before the last soldier crossed back over the Mu Darya River in February of 1989. Let that number breathe for a moment. $50 billion bled out over 9 years from an economy that was already a patient on life support, from a state whose total annual GDP was estimated at roughly $900 billion in 1979. The Afghan war consumed resources that could never be replaced and produced nothing that could be measured on a balance sheet. The Soviet Union formally dissolved on December 25, 1991. No invading army, no occupation, no bombs on Moscow. The empire that had terrorized the Western world for 4 decades, that had pointed the equivalent of 10,000 nuclear warheads at American cities, that had launched the first satellite and sent the first human to space, ceased to exist because its balance sheet reached zero. The nuclear arsenal that remained scattered across the ruins of 15 newly independent nations represented one of the most dangerous financial liabilities in human history. Ukraine alone inherited approximately 4,000 nuclear warheads. The cost of securing, accounting for, and dismantling that inherited arsenal fell substantially on the United States through the Non-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, which committed approximately $10 billion American dollars between 1991 and 2013 to buying back the Cold War's outstanding invoices. $10 billion spent by the winner to clean up the loser's unpaid bills. The ultimate liquidation sale. Russia formally inherited Soviet external debt, recorded at approximately $67 billion by 1991, but the actual cost of the Cold War's financial collapse was incalculable in any honest accounting. Social infrastructure that had been systematically starved for 4 decades required complete rebuilding. Environmental destruction from Soviet military and industrial programs, including nuclear test sites across Kazakhstan, the death of the Aral Sea, the poisoned groundwater beneath dozens of weapons facilities, carried cleanup price tags that dwarfed the debt figures. Some estimates for post-Soviet nuclear site remediation alone run into the hundreds of billions of dollars. Russia would not repay its Soviet-era obligations in full until August of 2017, 26 years after the red flag came down from the Kremlin for the last time. Let that sink in. The final check written on the Cold War arms race was deposited in 2017. If your parents were in elementary school during the Cuban Missile Crisis, their children were still paying the interest when the account finally closed. The human ledger ran longer than any financial one. A generation of Russians born in the 1970s came of age inside economic collapse. Hyperinflation in 1992 destroyed lifetime savings within months. The ruble lost 90% of its purchasing value in a single year. State enterprises that had employed millions simply stopped functioning.